right? Are we trying to deal with the problems of the day, or are we trying to teach students something that's eternally true? The problems of the day are going to be solved later by that foundation that they've gotten.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm Jessica Aboud, and I am here with our Core 4 cast, Paul, Tanya, and Martin. Hey, everybody.
Hello.
We are rounding the corner into summer here on campus.
We are. Last week of school.
I know. There's a buzz everywhere.
By the time this goes out, though, everybody will be on their summer vacation.
It'll be empty around here.
It will, except for us.
That's right. That's right.
I love it when all the kids come back, but I also love it when they leave, when it's so quiet.
Mm-hmm. I wonder why I don't get a summer vacation.
Well, it's because we send you to conferences.
Come here and work.
You only work 2 days a week. I feel like you're
see me work 2 days a week.
I feel like you're on vacation most of the time.
I do recall that I think that when I started working here, I think I worked here for a month before I even saw Martin.
Sounds right. We love you, Martin.
Yeah. Because I'm out talking to people.
What the
I'm at
heck?
conferences.
What is that?
It's a pen.
Oh, Martin. Is that an artifact?
Did
Martin?
you get that off of the children's
It's like a
shelf of a
Middle-earth
toy
pen.
store? Oh, where did you get that?
I don't know. Somebody gave it to me.
Okay.
All right. Well,
So I thought I would bring it on the show.
On to better things.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to talk about what we're reading as we move into summer. And then we are going to take some time to define our terms. What we mean when we use words we use all the time, like classical, progressive, traditional. You might listen to an episode or read an article and think, what do they actually mean by that? And today, we're going to define those terms. Before that, what is everybody reading?
This giant ink pen is killing me.
This really is bothering her. So I'm going to bring it every show.
Large.
I am going to answer Jess's question rather than what's going on over there. I picked back up Independent People since The Name of the Rose. I had to put it down to finish The Name of the Rose. And so I'm now getting back into the Icelandic epic. And
Can you remember what you read before?
Thankfully, it's actually in parts, and I had gotten into part 2 and read like one chapter, so I had to go back to the beginning of part 2 because I remembered how part 1 ended, but I couldn't figure out because there was also a shift in the book, right? Like when you go from a part 1 to a part 2, all of a sudden I'm like, wait, the guy has like 5 kids now, and and in part 1 his wife had passed away and he had 1 kid, so I didn't understand how I jumped, so I reread chapter 1 and then I'm off to the races.
I did that with War and Peace. It worked out fine as long as you quit within a volume. It does work out fine.
Yeah.
So I wrote down what I'm reading because I can't remember the name of this book, which makes no sense at all. The name of it is You Are What You Love by James K.A. Smith.
Have you read it?
Somebody recommended it to me, and I can't remember who.
It's a shorter version of a larger book you read.
Oh, okay.
Desire in
Have
the
we
Kingdom.
talked about it on here? Because
I don't know. I don't think
so I'm reading it, and I'm really enjoying it.
It's a small...
It
book?
is.
Yeah.
Well, it's about like this. And then I picked up, do you ever get to that point where you look at your bookshelf and think, there's so many books here I haven't read, and it's really hard to decide what you want to read. So I did that. And then I picked up this little mystery by Georgette Heyer, who she wrote Regency romances, but she also wrote a bunch of mysteries. And she was at the same time as Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie. So her books are entertaining, but I just thought I'm just going to pick something up for the weekend until I figure out what I really want to read. And I thought I'm going to go back and read Sense and Sensibility again. I just have been. So then Catherine said to me yesterday, our HR Catherine, she said, have you read James by Percival Eliot? And I said, no. And she said, do you think I need to go back and read Huck Finn first? Because it's Jim's side of the Huck Finn story. And I said, no, that sounds amazing. So I'm going to do that with her. We're going to read Huck Finn, just like I did with Barbara Kingsolver and David Copperfield. And then we're going to read the modern James by somebody I've never heard of and just see how the parallels work and if they work, if the author succeeds. So that's my next. Oh, but then, so I went from not knowing what to read. Now there's too many choices because Frederick Backman's new book is out. So I bought that and I love everything he wrote. So I'm going to have to read that too.
Is that a British murder mystery?
No, it's not. He is he Dutch or Swedish? I can't remember. But they're quirky modern books. There's a bunch of them. Catherine also got me started on him. So did you see the Tom Hanks movie, The Man Called Ove?
Ove?
Well, I think it's really,
O-V-E.
I think it was pronounced
O-V-E.
Ove.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Is it? Oh.
Yes, we figured that out because everybody was in America was calling him Ove. When you read the book, because it's OVE. He wrote that book that movie came from.
That was the Tom Hanks movie, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, he's a modern author, but I really like his writing. Anyway,
sounds like
just
a lot of modern. Ugh.
It is a lot of modern with Huck Finn thrown in the middle.
That's true. Mark Twain is enjoyable.
And I haven't read it for years, so it'll be fun.
I think I mentioned I'm reading Passing the Torch by Lou Marcos, who we gave the Parnassus Prize to last summer.
2 summers ago.
2 summers ago. And then one I haven't mentioned, because I'm reading 2 or 3 books right now, is The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, but I can't remember the name of the author. But it's also very excellent.
I've seen that.
Oh, it's good. It's very good. I'm really enjoying it. About halfway through.
Okay, well, moving right along, we thought it would be helpful to define the terms we use all the time because, like a lot of words, they mean different things to different people. So I think this is going to be one of those episodes that people save and share with their friends just to make sure.
If we pull it off.
Right. I think we can. We'll have to kind of rapid fire so we can get through it all, but will be a very helpful resource. So because we have a lot of terms to cover, let's start with the big one, classical. Martin, what is your working definition of classical when we say classical education?
Well, I always try to sort of give 2 related definitions because there's one that if you had used the word classical 100 years ago, that would have definitely involved the learning of Latin and Greek. Okay, so now we use it in a little bit more general sense to mean what really broadly classical education was for. And that is for passing on Western civilization. That's what it always, it was sort of the, Aristotle's spinal cause. What is it for? What's its purpose? It was to pass on Western civilization. That's what it's for. And we did that through, reading the tradition, reading the books that have come down to us in Western culture. And it used to be, and the reason that Latin and Greek was so important for that originally was because that's what the books were written in, and there were not a lot of English translations of those books. When they became available in English translations, that alleviated some of the necessity to know Latin and Greek, but the learning of Latin and Greek had other benefits other than just being able to read those things, mental development and vocabulary and that sort of thing. So,
hang on. Okay. I mean, you're basically saying that it's just as good to read a book in translation as it is to read in its You did, because you said that now we don't have as much of a necessity to read books in Latin because they've been translated.
I'm saying there's other benefits to it. When you literally couldn't read it unless you read it in the original language, you had more of a reason for doing it than We do now because we can read it in English. That's not saying that Latin and Greek are not important. I made that clear
but I think they're important for that reason, though. I mean, wouldn't we say it would be better to be able to read War and Peace in Russian if you can read it in Russian?
Yes.
Okay, so
but I'm not. You're,
the fact that we have translations doesn't negate the fact that it's better to read an author.
You're reading a lot into what I said, and I'm talking in English.
I'm very glad that Tanya brought this clarification to the table, because it means that there's probably a lot of people who are hearing what out of your mouth the way Tanya heard it. So I'm glad that clarification has been made.
Yeah, I think that in a program that's classical, you should strive in any way you can to teach those languages. But we, for example, don't teach a reading knowledge of Greek.
We teach 2 years.
Now, I'm hearing you say that you don't think teaching Greek is important.
No. What I'm saying is that one of the reasons we say for Latin and Greek is the culmination of a classical education is like the culmination is to be able to read those authors in their primary language. And so when you say that we don't have as much of a necessity anymore because we have translations we can read, it sounds like the translations are just as good.
No, that's literally not what I said. I said that there is more of a reason there used to be more of a reason because you couldn't read them at all, even in the English. Mm-hmm. That's more reason than we have now. Now we have really good reasons for doing it, but I'm just saying, and I'm also just defining the general definition of classical. We call schools, we include schools in the schools that work with us where they do not teach a reading knowledge of Latin and Greek, but we say they're classical because they're doing all that and trying to work their way up to that. And I think that's just fine.
And what else are they doing if they're not doing the languages?
They're passing on.
No. They are doing the languages. I think this is an important distinction, but they are, but because of maybe the immaturity, not a negative way, but just the immaturity of their school, the youth of their school, they may not have gotten their students to a point where they're not pumping out graduates that can read the original text in the original languages.
There's many classical schools that never get that far.
But I think we would stand very, very strongly on if you are not doing Latin or Greek, or if you've relegated Latin to just 1 or 2 years and that you feel like that's enough and you never have to grow that any further and you're just doing that in 7th and 8th grade and you're done, like that does not make you a classical school. It is the attitude of when you're teaching the liberal arts and you're teaching grammar and logic and rhetoric, and that stuff is the learning of the ancient languages actually teaches that better than doing that solely in English, right? Like I think we have to make this abundantly clear.
Right. Because for most classical students, all they're going to get, they will never make it up to a really good reading knowledge in Latin and Greek, but the studying of it will have its own benefits. I think that's what you're saying.
You're saying, I think you
aim for learning those things, but even if you don't achieve that, the attempt to do that in and of itself is a huge educational benefit.
Yes, but I would say that the goal of the movement ought to be that we get to a point where it's not most don't attain this. It is actually, in fact, most attain this, but we're having to grow as a movement to the point where that is a regular thing as opposed to an anomaly.
Yeah, and this sort of reminds me of Chesterton's remark that anything worth doing is worth doing badly. And that applies here because even if you fail to do the ultimate kind of classical education you would like to have, knowing the Latin and Greek, you will still have gained far more than in any other way of doing education.
And our students here, FYI, they do have 2 years of Greek grammar, but after that, they do have the option to continue their Greek, and they do read. They do get there.
Not all get to that reading level, but those that choose to.
We haven't failed, but with the ones who haven't gotten to a reading knowledge in Greek.
No.
Well, they do get to a translatable knowledge of they're not necessarily reading original Homeric text, but they do have, because of their facility in Latin and they learn the Greek grammar, they can can start translating
Right.
by the
And
time.
so we're all agreed that we don't always get to our ultimate goal in classical education. But even if we don't get all the way to the end, it's still a great, great education. There's still things that you get from it. If it's not the actual reading knowledge, it's at least all the things that you learn from studying Latin grammar and studying Greek and all that.
Yes. So maybe we can maybe package this
I'm
definition
trying
a little
to.
bit.
So you would say classical education, some of the load-bearing walls are Greek and Latin,
Mhm.
and at least the goal and the hope of progressing through those as far as a student could.
Yes.
When at the point they begin.
But again, Aristotle said in Greek that the most important definition is what's called final cause, is what is the purpose of a thing. And the purpose of even Latin and Greek are means to an end. And the end is passing on your culture. That's what the Greeks did. It was important for them to read Homer. That's what the Romans did. It was important for them to read Virgil. And we still, this is why there's a great emphasis in classical education on literature and history, because those are the things that pass down to us our ideas and values. Even if you can't read it in Latin and Greek.
Right.
Even if you have to read it in English.
If I could put a bow on this, I think when we say classical, what do we mean by classical and classical education? What we're talking about is the study of the liberal arts and the humanities from the perspective of Greece and Rome, that we're going to pass that on to our kids. And that when we say liberal arts, that includes the study of the ancient languages, because that's the best way to learn that. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that learning those languages makes the student a part of those civilizations in a way that learning those about those civilizations in your own modern language is not going to make you a part of it.
Exactly.
And that's why that's important.
And I think, and I agree with you that we would say to schools, this is the ultimate goal, is that your students are able to read some primary authors in Latin, but it took us a long time to get there. Mm-hmm. It takes time. Mm-hmm. And so we wouldn't say that a school is not a classical school if they're doing Latin every year, but they're not yet at the point where they can get that far. We wouldn't say you're not classical until you can read.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's helpful.
But we would say goal, right? To be a classical school, everybody's got to be taking Latin.
Your North Star
all the way.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. How about the term neoclassical?
Well, neoclassical really has been a confusing term to me.
Yeah.
It has. I think when I use that term, what I'm referring to is generally the emphasis on method that
Dorothy Sayers.
Well, Dorothy Sayers, but also like curricular method, like a history cycle.
Oh, right.
And that your literature has to tie into that history. And it's sort of like the trappings of like people look and they're looking for like what's one thing I can look at this and go, I think that's classical. And what they're looking for are the stages of the trivium from Sayers, or they're looking for the history cycles, but they're not looking at, is this deeply rooted in Greco-Roman culture and passing on that civilization and their languages. I think that's the defining difference between when you say something's neoclassical and what's classical. And to be honest and maybe a little harsh, is that I think people that embrace sort of the neoclassical perspective don't have a deep understanding of the medievals and how they were pulling this stuff out of the ancients into the Christian world. And that when we use the term classical as opposed to neoclassical, we're really talking about this medieval and Renaissance ideal that's carrying on this stuff, as opposed to one that is just looking at modern education and going, we want something that's methodologically a little better.
And a medieval ideal that Dorothy Sayers knew very well, translating Dante, and I think that we don't necessarily, I assume you would agree with this, that we don't necessarily mean that the three stages of learning are not legitimate or not good. They're perfect. That's a good taxonomy of learning, but today in education, and really for the last 100 years in this country, we're all about taxonomies of learning. That's all we know about how to teach, right? We don't talk about content much anymore. We talk about how you're supposed to teach, which cannot bear the full load of teaching. And so there are methodological considerations. Dorothy Sayers' taxonomy is one of them, although even Dorothy Sayers would not have said that her taxonomy was classical education. If you'd ask her what classical education was, she'd give you our definition pretty much.
Right. And she's trying to bring something additional to the table.
Yes.
And so I'm not saying neoclassical is bad.
Right.
I'm saying that I think neoclassical is partial.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I agree with that.
That's helpful.
And you can be classical and still be doing those things that you've said. You can be doing history in cycles if that makes you happy. You can tie your literature to your history, which we wouldn't recommend, but that doesn't mean you're not classical. Or if you're following Dorothy Sayers' stages, it doesn't mean you're not classical.
If that's what defined classical, then nobody would have been classically educated before Dorothy Sayers, including Dorothy Sayers.
Got it. Okay. So we've got classical and neoclassical defined. Let's contrast that with progressive education. What does that aim to accomplish? When we call something progressive, what do we mean by that?
Well, progressive education comes into the picture around the turn of the 20th century, and it was a part of the progressive movement where we're changing everything. You know, Teddy Roosevelt is changing New York City government, and all these people are doing all these reforms, right? So in comes John Dewey, who's a psychologist, and his reforms are to make education a lot more psychological than it really is cultural. And so we've been dealing with this for 125 years, and it really dominates modern education. This idea that everything has to be child-centered. Education should be truth-centered, should be reality-centered. You have to take the child's nature into consideration, but that's not what the child's psychology should not drive everything in education, and that's what progressive education has done.
And if not in an educational context, but just sort of looking at the term progressive and its downfalls, Chesterton in Orthodoxy has a chapter, I think it's the one on the Eternal Revolution, where he talks about the fact that progressivism as an ideal is constantly a moving target, right? There's not actually an objective truth at the end at which we are seeking. It's just we want to change things in order to make things better, but that better is not a solid, unchanging thing. And that when you then apply that in the world of education, that's what you constantly see. There's not one thing that is held up as this is what we want them to be. We just want progress. Progress itself is the ideal, and which then leaves the school fairly rudderless, right? And Martin has said a lot in his talks that progressivism is trying to change the culture by means of the student, right? Your goal is progress and culture by using the student. But then I'm pointing out, and because of what Chesterton says, like, what really is that progress? What are we actually aiming for? And that goal constantly shifts with the tides of the political climate.
And I think a big symptom of whether you're involved in a progressive school or a progressive situation in education is the first question I would ask is, what's the curriculum? Because if the curriculum is just, at the whim of each teacher, there's no consistency, the students aren't getting an education that has been thought out from the top down. And so I think you see in a lot of schools now, they don't even have textbooks. They just, I was talking to somebody recently whose high school student has no books.
What do they have?
Well, they've got tablets, and so they're reading off their tablets, and they've got math worksheets.
And the goal is not to read a whole book, right? The goal is to go read selections, and so you can do that on a tablet easily. You're not going to go buy a whole book to read, a chapter of it.
That's the first sign to me is what is the curriculum. And the second thing would be when you look in a classroom, if the students are facing each other rather than the teacher, then that would tell you that is child-centered. And
it's
an
also
aspect of progressive.
I've been in many classrooms like that, and they'll have the students their desks are facing each other, and then the teacher gets aggravated because they're talking to each other. Well, that's what the desks are telling them to do. Yeah. You set up the desks so they're facing it. You've already told them that you're supposed to talk to each other, and it's like turn the desks around and make them face you. If that's what you want them to do, you want them to pay attention, then have their desks face you. I mean, it's not rocket science, and you wonder why they wonder what's wrong, because it's clear what's wrong.
And I would also say that a sign you're in a progressive school is also like, what are the problems or what does the school place emphasis on insofar as where all the energy is going, right? Mm-hmm. Are we trying to deal with the problems of the day, or are we trying to teach students something that's eternally true, right? And if we're trying to teach something that is unchanging true, the problems of the day are going to be solved later by that foundation that they've gotten, right? And if what the administration and the teachers are all pushing are the problems of the day, the conversation of the day, then you're probably in a progressive school, because that's all they want to talk about is how do we solve today's problems, not let's learn something that's unchanging and solid.
Let's learn the general principles of our civilization so that we can judge whether anything is right and wrong now that people are doing. They just don't have any standard. They don't teach a standard. So it's always shifting.
I think that's helpful. Okay. That brings to mind, though, for me, the word traditional, because I hear us use that word, but can someone define it? Because is that just something that's not progressive, but maybe it's not classical? Or does it mean conservative? Can it be incorporated into, It's kind of squishy for me.
I feel like Tanya should take this one.
No.
What traditional is?
Yeah.
In my mind, it is exactly the opposite of progressive. Okay. I mean, it is everything that we've said is wrong with the progressive education would be fixed in a traditional classroom. Mm-hmm. What is traditional does feel like, you use the word conservative. I don't know that I would use that word.
They're not kind of linked.
Because
to me, they're not.
Would you stick this in the category of pedagogical? Like traditional is very much like directed towards pedagogy? Definitely.
But I think also curriculum. I think, we're studying a traditional curriculum that has been around for a long time. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have our version of it, but it's still, we're studying Aristotle and Plato and Dante and Shakespeare. And that to me is traditional. Mm-hmm. We're not reading 20th century. The books that I'm reading for entertainment at home, our students aren't reading those books. Mm-hmm. That to me is not traditional. So I don't have a good...
But I think also, so that's curricularly traditional.
And pedagogically also right? would be the teacher in front of the classroom.
Yeah.
Teaching all day, totally exhausting, but it means that time on task is very important, that content is very important, that you have so much that you need to teach these children that you don't have time for them to be looking at each other, talking to each other, because there's so much to do and they have so much to learn. Mm-hmm.
And traditional really takes us out of the whiplash of fads, right?
Yes.
Because if that is an ideal or a goal or a hallmark of what you do, then that means when somebody else comes along and says, well, why don't you try this new thing that we came up with? You're like, well, it's not traditional. I don't need to put my students through a whole experiment of, is that going to work on them?
Well, and I think then that leads us to technology and the fact that because we are educating traditionally, we're educating in the same way that our founding fathers were educated is our goal. And that didn't include all this technology that's there now. That really is, I don't know that it's a fad. It's not going anywhere, but it's not necessary. Mm-hmm. It's a distraction. And so
digital resources, that sort of
right.
thing.
So that makes us old fashioned.
Yeah, but technology is a fad in the sense of, I mean,
In education, it's a
in education, because even if you're trying to teach, let's say you were trying to teach the use of technology, within 10 years,
it's gone.
that's
right.
gone, right? It's a very different kind of technology, right? And I mean, I was doing a lot of reading yesterday on AI and advocates saying like, we need to start, instead of banning it from schools, we need to embrace it. And I'm like, the whole point of education is to teach the child, give the child the skills to be able to evaluate. And if you're outsourcing that when they're in the school to something else, they're not ever going to be able to evaluate that machine.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's
and,
right.
And so it's important actually not to do that. And that's when, and I suppose that puts me very much in the traditional camp.
Well, and I've talked about the book Range, How Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein. And his point is basically the more technological we become, the more important a general broad education, not a specialized education, becomes, because the changes are so fast, and when it is that way and things are changing all the time, you have to have some place to stand intellectually, and so you're far better off getting a general education, because you're going to be more prepared for the next thing that comes along that you didn't anticipate, because you know how to think. And you have a body of knowledge that you have learned, and so on.
That's an interesting point. So putting a generalized education under the umbrella of traditional, because it's true. That's true. That you never, like, if you go back 300 years, 400 years, whatever, or 100 years, education was it was always generalized.
And classical education is a general education. It's not specialization.
Yeah. And I think that's a very important point, because you can't, if you don't have that generalized education, you're not going to be a scientist that can see the big picture. You're only going to be able to see the tiny little thing in front of you.
I think it's downright terrifying to think that we aren't teaching content anymore, but that we are depending on AI to answer all of our questions. I mean, think about when that technology fails to work, and we're just empty shells because we don't know anything.
Artificial intelligence drives out authentic intelligence.
It's scary to me.
It'll be interesting to see,
because we don't feel like we think that students need to. I just recently had a conversation with Brian about the periodic table. He just really wants 7th graders to memorize the periodic table. And I said, well, what's the purpose of that? I mean, they can just look at it. And he said, but they need, in their heads, they need to, if they've got it, then they don't have to look at it. And then whenever they go on to do upper level science, the ones that do, some will never use it.
Well, artificial intelligence can answer your questions, but the more important thing is being able to answer is being able to ask the right question.
But you need a vast knowledge to actually know what question to ask.
That's right.
And the whole periodic table thing, that's the same question. Like, why do students need to memorize their Latin vocab when they could just look it up?
Right.
Well, why study your arithmetical facts if you have a calculator to do?
Right.
Yeah.
yeah.
But
And
that's where we're headed.
Yeah.
And the traditional way to approach that is by knowing the stuff,
Right.
and not depending on some extrinsic thing to do it for you.
And the traditional response to that is education is about training skills. I mean, that's one of the massive parts of education. And so if you're removing the exercise of practicing that skill, you've just removed what they're learning at all.
Right.
Right.
It is scary.
You've just taught them how to look things up on AI, and even I can do that. It's easy.
And you never know whether they're right. There's a lot of
That's true.
answers technology gives you that are just simply
Well, that's
not
the
correct.
other thing, is you would never know. You would have no ability to discern if you don't know anything.
You cannot, depending on technology, just diminishes your ability to judge rightly.
And it sounds like the beginnings of where that judgment is undermined is the earlier it's introduced. That's kind of what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes, hopefully adults will have the ability to use technology responsibly, but students aren't.
Often, yes.
I feel like we're ending on a downer.
No,
I have one more word.
Oh, okay.
A word that I don't know we use all that often, but I think it would be interesting to define, and that is vocational.
Well, okay. So modern education has two aspects to it. And one is that progressivist political social reform aspect, and the other is this vocational emphasis. Those are the two things that characterize modern education. And
should we use our Latin to define vocational?
Go ahead,
it's kind of fun, right? It's, vocational coming from vocal vocarius, your calling, right? But it's used in the context of training, right? So, like your vocational education would be learning to weld or going to shop class or
being a nurse,
those sorts of things. That I think we would say, correct me, Martin. I'm going to give you a chance to correct me if I'm wrong. But that you would call an education vocational when everything in it is geared towards that thing, right? If we're teaching you a generalized traditional classical education, you're gonna be able to walk out of there, go to nursing school for 3-4 years, you're ready to be a nurse, right? But when everything in your education is geared towards, you just need to learn biology and you need to learn your arithmetic to be able to calculate drug doses, and that's all you need, then that's a vocational education because they're stripping out the rest of everything else to that one goal.
Yes, but then what happens is maybe you haven't learned to be an ethical person or a compassionate person because you've just been focused on what it takes to be a nurse, but you're not a whole person.
Maybe they could just add a Compassion 101 course to
Martin's
the nursing program.
You don't know how to be a good citizen. We could just have another
specialty. Yeah, I mean, this is the problem with modern education. Another way to say vocational is that education is to enable you to get a job. Okay, and that is not traditionally been a goal of education. I mean, it does enable you to do that, but it does it by, as Paul was explaining, a very different means. I mean, if you can think and you can judge and you can communicate with people, you're going to be better in no matter what job you do. And the other thing is, schools are not good places for job training. They don't do it very well. We live in this modern tech economy. We're going to prepare our children in K through 12 for the modern tech economy. Who at your school is going to do that? Tell me the people at your school who know as much as the kids know about technology. It's the blind leading the blind. and it's terrible. They really think this. And then, in my district, a 13-year-old sophomore was running the IT department because no adults at the school knew how to do it. But they're going to teach your kid to fit into the modern tech economy. I mean, it's ridiculous. It really is absurd to have that as a goal.
But I would, at the risk of getting jumped on here, say
we're ready.
As and as the
he's
farmer
got his
in the group,
large pen.
As the farmer in the group,
if this hits you, you're dead, dude.
Should have worn my hard hat. But it is. I don't want anybody to hear us and go, they don't want students to get like manual skills or it's a bad thing to go become a nurse. No, that's not what we're saying at all.
Right.
What we're saying is when it gets stripped away, right? And that's the only goal towards it. And I've got a nephew that we look at him and we're like, he's going to be a farmer. And, it became a conversation of, are we going to, my sister was like, well, I don't know that he needs the kind of education Highlands gives because that's probably not what he's going to be doing. And I was like, that's exactly why he needs it. He needs that broad education that's going to prepare him to do whatever he can. And that's going to make him a better farmer. Right. And that means on nights and weekends and, early in the mornings, he's coming out and he's doing stuff with me and he's learning how to use his hands. But those two things have to be held in tension and not, you don't completely leave one aside because you're like, well, this person's affinity is for X, Y, or Z. I know of a family who they classically educated, homeschooled with a hybrid school, and their child was getting scholarships from Mike Rose Foundation. That's all about manual work, right? And they were coming to Louisville. There was a massive convention here for that, and they came here in order to participate in that. And I can't remember what manual job the child was getting into, but it was very much like, okay, we've given you this generalized education. Now you're ready to go out and do something. But his interest was doing something manual, right? And so I don't want anybody to hear it like it's a bad thing to train them vocationally. No,
it's just not enough.
It's not enough.
And there's a place and a time for it.
Yeah.
And early education is not it. It really, I think it's tragic that in schools now, I don't know if they're still doing this, but they were like tracking students from 7th grade. Like if you thought you wanted to be an engineer in the 7th grade, do we know what did you want to be in the 7th grade? Are you that?
I wanted to be like 7 different things from 2nd grade on.
I mean you don't know what you want. Yeah, I just think kids are missing so much if they're stuck in this track.
Well, and in the public schools, they that's what they want to do. They want to track you, and they want to give you like what are basically majors starting in 8th grade. And one parent called me and said, they want us to, little Danny here, they want him to tell them what he wants to do. So tell him he wants to be a minister and see what they do.
Curveball.
Yeah.
But I think the point we're making is that at least from our perspective, one of the major goals of our educational framework is whole person formation. And that's why it's important to get, you want skills to be in the workforce, contribute to your community.
This is what I was going to say. If you're going to be a welder, you're going to be a drywaller, you're going to be an electrician, you're still going to be a human being.
Right.
And the only education that's going to make you a better human being is one that teaches you wisdom and virtue.
Right.
And that's what classical education does.
In the 7th grade, I wanted to be Lori Partridge.
I don't know, who's that?
Martin's the only one old enough to recognize this. So the Partridge family.
Okay, talk about dating yourself.
She was the daughter who played the piano and sang, but she couldn't really sing, so she just sang background behind David Cassidy, and I really wanted to be her.
You never heard Get Happy by the Partridge family?
No, but so what you're telling me is that if your school had been a vocational school,
I would have done piano, and I had no skill at all. I couldn't sing, but it was just, that's what I would have chosen in the 7th grade.
We are so glad no one let you do that.
There you go.
It's really terrible, but I even know that actress's name.
That's right.
That's how behind. That's how
Susan Day.
Ancient we are. Was it? Oh, it was Susan Day. I was thinking of something different. Okay, yeah.
Well,
so he didn't.
Okay,
know.
so you're more nerdy than I am. That's the conclusion of that.
Well, I just wanted to be her.
Oh.
So she was probably a stalker. She knew everything about her.
That's right.
Wow. All right. Well, I think it would be better if we cut off at what you said about the classical education.
When we get into the Partridge family, it's time to go.
Well, Martin, that was a wonderful way to wrap it up. That was great.
We started a firestorm at the beginning. It's always fun.
That's right. Yes. And thank you, everybody, for helping us define the terms. Thank you for joining us. We hope you come back next time where we will be answering all of your questions in our mailbag episode. You can still squeeze some in if you email podcast@memoriapress.com. We would love to hear from you and to answer your questions on the next episode. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us today on Classical Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.